I was halfway through a standard site audit report when my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Mandatory all hands, boardroom, 2 p.m. It was a Tuesday in February. There was still snow on the ground outside our Edmonton office. I remember thinking it was odd timing. We were 3 weeks out from a major federal contract renewal, and nobody had mentioned any meeting that morning. I finished my coffee, saved the file, and walked down the hall. My name is Derek. I'd been a licensed construction project administrator for 22 years. I'd started at the company right out of BCIT, back when it was still a mid-sized regional firm with one office and a fleet of pickup trucks that needed new shocks every winter. By the time that Tuesday rolled around, we had 4 offices across Alberta and BC, and I was the senior compliance officer, the person whose name appeared on every federal infrastructure agreement, every provincial safety certification, and every bonding document we'd ever filed. 31 certifications in total, every single one of them issued to me personally. I didn't make a big deal about that. It was just how it worked in our industry. The certifications followed the individual, not the company. I'd explained this to management more than once over the years, usually when a new HR director came in and wanted to tidy up how credentials were documented. I'd say it plainly, these aren't company property, they live with me, and if you want to keep operating on federal projects, you need to keep me around. They'd nod, take a note, and move on. By February of that year, there was a new layer of management that hadn't been around for those conversations. Her name was Brittany. She'd joined the company 8 months earlier as VP of Operational Efficiency, a title that hadn't existed before she arrived. She was the daughter-in-law of our majority shareholder, a fact that was technically never stated out loud, but that everyone in the office understood within about a week of her start date. She was 31, sharp in her presentation, and completely unfamiliar with how federal construction compliance actually worked on the ground. She'd spent her first few months reorganizing the org chart. A lot of people got new titles. Some people got moved into roles with less decision-making authority, dressed up with fancier names. I got reclassified. My new category, according to the internal HR system, was Legacy Infrastructure Support. I found out when I tried to book a flight for a site visit in Fort McMurray and the travel approval form spat back an error saying my role category wasn't eligible for discretionary travel. I went to the office manager. She looked uncomfortable. She said Brittany's team had done a sweep of all role classifications as part of a lean operations initiative. I was now considered non-essential travel. I let it go that day. I had work to do. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things. My name had been removed from the distribution list for the federal project briefings, the same briefings I used to chair. A junior coordinator named Kyle was now sitting in on the calls I used to run. When I flagged this to my direct manager, a decent man named Paul who looked genuinely pained by the whole situation, he told me Brittany was modernizing the workflow and that I should trust the process. I asked Paul directly, does Brittany understand what my certifications cover? He said he was sure she had a handle on it. 2 weeks later, she walked into my office and told me the company was going to be transitioning my responsibilities to a new, centralized compliance platform. She showed me a slide deck on her laptop. It was a software system, a subscription service based out of Toronto. The system would automate document tracking, she explained, and interface directly with the federal procurement portal. It was cost-effective. It was scalable. It was the future. I asked her one question. Had anyone checked whether federal compliance under the National Joint Council framework allowed automated third-party submissions in place of licensed signatory approvals? She said the platform had been vetted by their legal team. I asked if the legal team had checked specifically against the conditions of our existing Infrastructure Canada agreements, which required a named, licensed project administrator to authorize any compliance declaration. She smiled like I was asking about something quaint. Like I was a mechanic, worried that electric cars would put me out of work. We appreciate your institutional knowledge, Derek, she said. We're going to make sure that knowledge is captured before any transition. I went home that evening and pulled up my employment contract. The company had updated it 3 years earlier during a general HR refresh. There was a clause I remembered, but had never really needed to think about until that moment. If I was terminated without cause, all certifications that had been maintained with company funding, recertification fees, continuing education credits, professional association dues would be formally released and the company would have no ongoing claim to them. The certifications themselves, being personal professional designations, were mine by default. But the clause went further. If I was terminated, the company was also required to formally notify the relevant federal bodies that I was no longer their designated licensed representative, which would trigger a review period of no less than 60 days before any replacement could be approved. I read it twice. Then I made a cup of tea and read it a third time. 60 days. In the middle of federal contract renewal season, I didn't tell anyone about this. I just kept coming to work and doing my job and watching the situation unfold with a kind of quiet attention I hadn't felt in years. The all hands on that Tuesday in February was not what I expected. Brittany stood at the front of the boardroom with a slide titled Phase 2 Structural Realignment. She thanked everyone for their contributions to the company's growth. She talked about efficiency. She used the phrase right-sizing 4 times. Then she said my name. She said the company was moving to a new compliance model and that my position was being eliminated effective the end of the month. She said I'd receive full severance, 1 week per year of service, standard practice under the Canada Labour Code, and that HR would reach out to schedule an exit interview. 22 years. 22 weeks of severance. The room was very quiet. A few people looked at me. I didn't change my expression. After the meeting, I went back to my office, closed the door, and called my employment lawyer. I told her what had happened. She asked me a few questions about the certifications. Then she was quiet for a moment and said, "Derek, I want you to be very precise about what you do next." I told her I intended to be. Over the next 2 weeks, before my official last day, I did everything exactly right. I completed every file I had open. I documented every active certification, every renewal date, every federal body contact. I handed over a comprehensive transition binder to Paul, who accepted it looking like a man receiving news he didn't want but already knew. On my last day, I submitted the formal notification to the Canadian Construction Documents Committee, to Infrastructure Canada's Regional Compliance Office, and to the Alberta Safety Codes Council. I, Derek Paulson, was no longer the designated licensed representative for the company, effective immediately. Then I went home, took my dog for a walk along the river valley, and started making calls. I had 3 interviews in my first week out. I want to be honest about that. I was 53 years old and I was genuinely nervous those first few days. 22 years in one place does something to you. You forget that the skills you have are yours, not the company's. You forget that you built something other people can see. By the end of week 2, I had 2 offers. One from a competitor in Calgary, one from a federal consulting firm in Ottawa that worked directly with Infrastructure Canada on project compliance. The Ottawa firm offered me a contract rate that was 60% higher than my salary. I took a week to think, then I signed. I was still in my first month at the new firm when my former colleague Dana sent me a message. Dana was still at the company. She'd been my admin support for 11 years and was one of the most organized people I'd ever worked with. She didn't usually send personal messages, so when one came in at 7:40 in the morning, I read it right away. She wrote, "I don't know if you're allowed to share information, but I need to let you know something is happening here." I called her. She picked up on the first ring. She told me that 2 weeks after my departure, the company had received a formal notice from Infrastructure Canada. Their 3 active federal infrastructure contracts, including the renewal they'd been preparing for, were suspended pending compliance review. The reason cited was that the company's designated licensed representative had filed a notification of departure and no replacement had been approved. The review period was 60 days minimum. All billing on the suspended contracts was frozen. The company had approximately $4.2 million in project work sitting idle. Brittany had apparently called an emergency meeting the morning the notice arrived. According to Dana, who heard this from someone who was in the room, Brittany's first question was, "Can't we just upload the certifications to the platform?" Her second question, Once someone explained that the certifications were personal professional designations tied to an individual, was, who approved the contract terms that allowed this to happen? Nobody answered that one. The company's lawyer reached out to me through my employment lawyer 3 days later. They wanted to discuss a consulting arrangement. Could I provide transitional support during the compliance review period? They were prepared to compensate me for my time. My lawyer called me after the conversation. She was remarkably composed for someone delivering what was, functionally, fairly satisfying news. She said their offer was $200 an hour for up to 80 hours. I thought about that for a moment. I told her to counter at $350 with a minimum commitment of 100 hours, billed in advance, no exclusivity clause, and a written acknowledgement that the engagement was voluntary and at my discretion to terminate. There was a pause from the other side. Then they agreed. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I wasn't trying to punish the company. I genuinely wasn't. The people affected by the contract freeze included project workers on sites across northern Alberta, people who had nothing to do with Brittany's reorganization, who showed up every morning to do their jobs and were suddenly sitting on idle equipment waiting for paperwork to clear. I helped because I could, and because the work was mine to do. I spent about 6 weeks working with the compliance office, guiding the company's new candidate through the certification process, helping the federal reviewers understand the file history. I was professional. I was thorough. I answered every question anyone asked. I also billed every single hour. The company's new compliance candidate, a young woman who had actually worked under me for 2 years before being shuffled to a different department during Brittany's reorganization, passed her certifications on the first attempt. I wrote her a reference letter for the Federal Review Panel. She deserved it. The contracts were reinstated. The company paid my invoice in full without dispute. I finished that consulting engagement on a Friday afternoon, submitted my final report, and drove home in the used Land Rover I'd bought the month before. Not because I needed to make a statement, just because I'd wanted one for years and finally had a reason to stop waiting. There's a moment I keep coming back to from the day of the all-hands meeting. After Brittany had finished her presentation and people were filing out, I walked past her in the hallway. She was talking on her phone, already moving on to the next thing. She didn't look up. I thought about stopping and saying something. I thought about explaining, clearly and directly, what was about to happen to the company's federal standing the moment I filed that notification. I didn't. It wasn't cruelty. I'd already made my decision, and I knew what it meant for the company. It was just that I was tired of explaining things to people who had already decided they knew better. My father worked in the trades for 38 years. He used to say, "A man who can't read the blueprints shouldn't be running the site." He wasn't a complicated person, but he understood the difference between someone who looks like they know what they're doing and someone who actually does. The certifications on my wall right now, there are 31 of them still. They're not trophies. They're records of something I built over a long time, through night courses and exam weekends and early mornings reviewing code updates that nobody else wanted to read. They belong to me because I earned them. They're not a legacy. They're just my work. The Ottawa firm made me a full-time offer 3 months into my contract. I asked for a few days to think, walked along the Ottawa River on a cold Saturday morning, and said yes. I still take my dog for walks along the river valley when I'm back in Edmonton visiting family. The river doesn't care about org charts, it just keeps moving. I still think about that hallway moment sometimes. Brittany walking past me on her phone, already onto the next thing, completely unaware that the decision she'd made 2 hours earlier was going to freeze $4.2 million in contracts before the month was out. I could have said something. I chose not to. And I've made my peace with that choice, not because I wanted her to fail, but because I'd spent years saying the things that needed to be said in rooms where nobody wanted to hear them. There comes a point where you stop trying to warn people who've already decided you're not worth listening to. What I've come to understand looking back on all of it is that outcomes like mine don't come from luck or timing. They come from the slow, unglamorous work of actually knowing what you're doing and doing it with honesty over a very long period of time. I spent 22 years building something real, Not a reputation, not a personal brand, but a body of genuine competence. 31 certifications that I earned through night courses and missed weekends and early mornings reading regulatory updates that nobody else wanted to touch. That foundation didn't protect me because the universe decided to reward me. It protected me because it was real, and real things hold when everything else shifts. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the file that's complete when others are half finished, in the question asked when everyone else is nodding along, in the decision to do the transition binder properly on your last 2 weeks, even when the company doesn't deserve that care from you. I did that binder for Paul, and for Dana, and for the project workers in Northern Alberta who had nothing to do with any of this. That's the part I'm most settled about, honestly. Not the consulting invoice or the Land Rover. Those are fine, I'm glad they happened. But the fact that when it mattered, I behaved like the person I wanted to be. The thing about resilience that nobody really talks about is that it's not dramatic. It doesn't look like courage in the moment. It looks like going home after the worst Tuesday of your career, making a cup of tea, pulling out your contract and reading it carefully. It looks like calling your lawyer the next morning instead of sending an angry email. It looks like showing up every day for the remaining 2 weeks and finishing what you started, even when you're exhausted and a little bit heartbroken about a company you gave 2 decades to. My father wasn't a complicated man, but he taught me something I didn't fully appreciate until I was standing in a federal compliance office in Ottawa, explaining our file history to a reviewer. The work is the argument. You don't need to make a case for yourself if the record speaks clearly. Derek Paulson's record spoke clearly. That was enough. I think about the young woman who got her certifications and passed on her first attempt, the one Brittany had shuffled off to a different department during the reorganization. She deserved that reference letter. She'd been doing good work in a place that wasn't paying attention. I hope she knows that her own record is building right now, whether anyone is watching or not. That's the only thing I'd say to anyone sitting in a similar position today. Build something real. Be honest about what you know and what you don't, and stay standing when it gets hard. The rest has a way of sorting itself out.